Hello, good morning. Thank you for joining me for another little reflection over coffee. Today, I want to chat about religious experience and how it is something counter to what we imagine, that we do not want, we cannot want, that we are afflicted by, but we cannot avoid. And I want to talk about how do we avoid attempting to avoid it. Okay, so let's try and do that in 10 minutes. So, the common notion of religious experience is that it is a peak experience. It is something wonderful. You feel at one with everything. You penetrate beyond language. You feel the dissolving of the ego. You feel melted into the other melted into you, right? So that's one of the ways of describing it, but it's a very powerful experience that happens. Now, what's interesting, and I've talked about this in depth in seminars on my YouTube channel, so please go there to get some depth. This is just a little reflection. But counter to that is a strangely counterintuitive notion, and this is based on dialectics. So if you've been following this work for a while, you know that the dialectic process is a process in which there is an affirmation, there's a negation, and there's a negation of negation, and there's this flow. And if you do atheism for Lent with me this year, you'll see what that means. You affirm God exists, then you deny God exists, God does not exist, which arises out of that. So the whole point is the opposite. When you go deep enough into the belief that God exists, you come to the idea that God does not exist. And then you go deeper into that and you come to this idea that God does not exist. And this brings you into some really interesting place. But the idea in dialectics is you have to, in a sense, choose the negative, not the positive. And a very simple example of that is it's very common for us, if we're depressed, to try to avoid the depression, to do things that will make us feel good, right? And of course, that's natural. I mean, that's very natural. That's a point that I want to come back to, but very natural for us to try to avoid the darkness, the depression. But if you go into analysis, what happens is the analyst doesn't sit and give you some positive mantras to say, right, and tell you, do some exercise, go out, do that. My life coach might, or a counselor might, even some forms of therapy, cognitive therapies, neurolinguistic therapies, etc., might do that. But analysis proper doesn't. It does something very counterintuitive, which is it asks you to go into the darkness, into the dark night of the soul. So instead of going, I want to avoid this door behind which there is horrible things, in analysis the analyst helps you creak and open that door, go into that place, not because they're sadistic. I mean, maybe they are, but that's not the point, right? The point is not so that you despair, not so that you are destroyed, but so that you're able to tarry with those things, negate them, and find a way to endure and even enjoy those elements of you. And it's not dissimilar to the basic things about people who have suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation it's usually called, but that instead of trying to avoid that conversation and try to cheer them up, you can go right into it and go, well, how would you do it? What things have you looked up, and where would you do it, and what would you say to the people who in terms of your suicide notes, right? What you do is, instead of avoiding it, it seems so counterintuitive, you go into it and you talk about it, and there's nowhere to go but into it. And the idea is you start to work through what those thoughts are and what those feelings are. So that's kind of dialectics. And in a similar way, there's a notion in Christianity that the peak religious experience is identifying with the crucified Christ, which means that the peak religious experience is not what you get like on ayahuasca, where you have this wonderful experience, right? But it's identifying with the one who is alienated, suffering, excluded, right? It's identifying with the one who is the complete outsider in the existentialist meaning of that term, right? This is very counterintuitive. Luther was great on this. Again, Luther, and there's a really strong dialectics in theology that's often missed, where someone like Luther would say that the progressive or kind of liberal theology is a type of theology that we would invent, because it reflects our values, it reflects what we want, our conscious desires, right? And so Luther said the idea of having a religious experience, for example, which is identification with crucifixion, death, suffering, alienation, it's almost like we wouldn't make that up, right? Like, because it would be madness. That's not what we want. We can never, as Simone Weil would say, we never want affliction. Now, we can enjoy a little bit of sadness and find enjoyment in that, of course, and get annoyment out of going on Instagram. But true affliction, we cannot ever consciously want, right? We are, in the ethical terms, our consciousness is at the level of the pleasure principle, or the utilitarian principle of maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain. So for Luther, he goes, so there's really something interesting in Christ crucified, and the idea that we should identify with that the peak experience is loss, alienation, suffering. Sorry, this is my Tesco delivery. I'm going to pause this and come back. Sorry, my Tesco delivery came, my groceries. So where was I? Oh yeah, I was saying that this idea of actually wanting to identify with grief, loss, suffering, alienation, of course doesn't make any sense. But dialectically, weirdly, it's the idea that if you want life, you have to embrace death. So what does that mean? Well, again, in short, I've gone into this in more detail at Coffee and Concepts last Sunday and in various videos. But if you imagine that there is a fundamental sacrifice that is part of becoming a subject. You separate from the primary caregiver to become a subject. So you're marked with a fundamental loss. And that this loss is also in everything, in creation itself. The mythology of this is the idea that if God is everything and all in all, then the first act of God was to contract, to create space for everything else, for not God. And so the death of God, the sacrifice of God, is the first and last act of God, in the kind of Simone Weil's reading of this. So the sacrifice is inherently part of us. We're all marked by loss. And that expresses itself in our language, where we can never fully say what we want to say, and in our bodily desire, in which we never seem to get something that fully satisfies us in a lasting way. Now, if that's the case, and Tillich would say, well, that's religious experience, the marking of a loss, a fundamental loss, which is reflected in the loss of God, which is redoubled in the crucifixion. So the crucifixion is just a repetition of a fundamental loss. When we identify with the crucifixion, we identify with that fundamental loss. And very concretely, right, one is you say, okay, well, that is everywhere, what Paul Tillich calls ultimate concern. But we try to avoid it. We try to escape from it. We actually seek peak spiritual experiences to avoid confronting this loss. So part of what Church of the Contradiction is about helping you actually embrace that part of yourself, that dissatisfaction, that lack, that self-questioning which appears in various ways like guilt and shame, right? And to rob it of its sting by embracing it. Now, when you go through something fundamental, and by the way, I'm doing this talk partly because our friend Mindy, who's part of this group and who was at Spark, texted me and asked me if I would talk a little bit about grief and loss. And so I want to connect this with spiritual experience to say, when you encounter in your history a loss, a really profound loss, somebody you love dies, or a relationship is lost, or health, or a job, or whatever it is, people who have lost everything in a disaster like what you see in LA or whatever, that touches on, that's a kind of personal loss that touches on this fundamental loss. It's a very negative, difficult experience. But in this notion in Church of the Contradiction, the idea here is not to comfort, like, and go, oh, it's going to be better, it's going to be great, or whatever, is to redouble a loss, to say, is to kind of create a space where they can be borne witness to. That loss can be symbolized in music, symbolized in sharing, symbolized in storytelling, symbolized in ritual. So one is that loss becomes symbolized, and two, in that symbolizing of it, we realize that there is a sense in which that loss, while it is impacting an individual incredibly deeply, is is part of this human condition. And it's not about saying, oh, it's okay. It's not about saying, oh, it's about saying that I can't fix you. I can't do anything to bring this back. But through community, through communion, through conversation, through art and literature, through just being borne witness to, this loss can be robbed of its sting. That's the religious experience. That in strangely identifying with the crucified Christ, in other words, in liturgically kind of having a liturgy which expresses doubt, grief, complexity and ambiguity in its structure with other people, you find not that you overcome the grief, but that somehow you're able to bear it. And that is something that marks you, that can be sublimated. In other words, you can take that suffering, that loss and that grief, and it might become something, whether it's some art that you create or some project that you give yourself to. So in a nutshell then, I'm saying there's the religious experience of kind of like a peak, oh, you feel at one with everything. And then there's this weird opposite to that, which is a religious experience in which, well, okay, there's a religious experience that we feel, oh, we are one with everything. Then that helps us avoid confronting loss and grief and alienation that's within ourselves, but which is the negative. But to negate the negative is to see that loss, that alienation and that grief is redoubled in the absolute and in the lives of other people. And when you're able to symbolize it, to speak of it, to put it into art, to mourn, you don't get rid of it, but it's transformed into something life-giving. That's the negation of negation. And that, I think, gets us to the core of what a kind of paratheological religious experience is. And at the beginning I said, we can never avoid this. And what I mean by that is, even if your life is going well, that loss still marks, you're probably just dealing with it very well and, you're happy with it and whatever, but still there's dissatisfactions and there's lacks of communication and there's little losses that you have. There's no way of avoiding that. We try to avoid avoiding it. Church of the Contradiction helps us to stop that avoidance. And then when the big things happen to us, we are better able to chew them and dissolve them and digest them, rather than them being something that overwhelms and overcomes us. So, yeah, I'll leave it there because this is already too long. Have a good day. Bye-bye.